Okay, we are live on YouTube. So thank you everyone who is tuning in. So we've had a really action-packed week with a number of talks for London Climate Action Week, but I'm quite excited about the one we're going to have today, specifically because it's also around a product that I think is quite revolutionary itself. So I can't wait to hear Sunit talk about everything he's going to share with us today. So today we're talking about SDG 17, which is Partnership for Goals. And the idea here is really to be able to show a lot of the audience and those who are watching how you can really build a business around innovative carbon conscious products or things that are going to really service the solutions that we need to take us into the next decade or century. So without further ado, I'm going to allow Sunit to take over and introduce himself and get started.
Thank you, Nimisha, and thanks for the great introduction. The title of the talk today is Hemp, Scaling Carbon Negative Green Solutions. So I'll be addressing one of the common bits of knowledge that 100 companies around the world are responsible for 71% of all emissions worldwide. And I'll be addressing it from the point of view of hemp. My name's Sunit, as I said, and I'm the managing director of Rare Earth Global. We're an organization focused on developing the infrastructure needed to bring hemp to market as a viable alternative to fossil fuels. And these products can be used in both energy and downstream products, such as plastics and in construction. Before I get into the speech itself, I just wanted to thank Nimisha again and Leaving Legacy CIC for inviting me to speak at the May of London Climate Action Week. As a Londoner, it's great to see how London's doing its part to drive forward such vitally important action. Also, the work Nimisha is doing with Leaving a Legacy is inspiring. Each individual can make a difference, and for everyone who's attending this talk today, Leaving a Legacy will plant a tree, which is a great initiative. We also hope that one day there will be one hemp plant or even an acre of hemp being planted too. So my talk will be addressing the Sustainable Development Goal number 17 and how hemp is one of the most exciting solutions we have today to tackle a large part of the global emissions that are being produced by these 100 companies around the world. Development Goal 17 is aimed at strong global partnerships and cooperations. These partnerships are more vital than ever, with the unfolding impact of COVID-19 still to be fully realized. The UN, in addressing this impact, asserts that an issue that is alarming for them is the prospect of a new debt crisis, compounded by tumbling prices for oil and other key commodities, which will heavily impact the least developed countries in the world that were already at high risk of debt distress. The companies responsible for the majority of global emissions are pertinent to this, as hemp provides a new commodity that can not only replace activities presently being done by oil, but also other fossil fuels. This will have not only an environmental impact with a carbon negative outcome, but will also open up opportunities in least developed countries where agriculture is the bedrock of many of their economies. Diving further into the claim around the 100 companies, this was taken and made popular by The Guardian and was based on a carbon majors data report published by the CDP in 2017. CDP was set up and was known as the Carbon Disclosure Project in the early 2000s. I won't go into why carbon and other polluting emissions are bad for the planet. That's a talk for another to address, but we'll cover the research that this is based on, what this means to our everyday lives, and how we can tackle this and drive impactful change. So as I mentioned, the CDP, or Carbon Disclosure Project, is an international nonprofit that since 2002 publicly disclosed environmental information from 8,400 of the largest companies around the world. The CDP is backed by investors who have over 110 trillion in assets and companies and organizations that have 5.5 trillion in purchasing power. This means simply that the CDP is driving transparency to global emissions backed by some of the most influential global investors and companies. The key takeaways from the 2017 report were that the 100 companies responsible for the 71% of global emissions produced 923 billion tons of CO2. Over half of the global industrial emissions were produced by just 25 of them, with many of them being state companies. And out of all of those 100 companies, all of them were fossil fuel companies. Diving further into those emissions, 90% of the emissions created by those companies were Scope 3 emissions, and they resulted from downstream combustion of coal, oil, and gas for energy purposes. In addition, a small fraction of the fossil fuel production was used in non-energy applications, which sequestered carbon. So the question is, if we're going to tackle the global emissions being produced by these 100 companies, knowing that they're responsible for 71% of them, how do we tackle them, and what do Scope 3 emissions actually mean? So Scope 3 emissions were set up by the Science-Based Target Initiatives, a partnership between CDP, the UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF. And it was set up as a way for scientific measurement of carbon emissions that previously wasn't possible. The International Energy Association have been measuring in the past, but until the CDP came to the forefront, that report in 2017 was the first global measurement on the scale that was carried out and was able to trace back emissions across organizations and companies around the world. The aim of the Science-Based Target Initiatives is to hold companies, or more likely governments, to account based on the commitments made in the 2015 Paris Agreement to curb global temperatures and the knock-on effects to our planet in general. So going back to the Science-Based Target Initiatives, those 100 companies were registered emitting both Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions, with 90%, as I mentioned, of Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions were direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from the sources that are controlled or owned by an organization. So an oil company, while they're running their everyday business, these are the emissions they create. Scope 3 emissions are the results of activities from assets not owned or controlled by that organization, that oil company, but the organization indirectly impacts in its value chain. So what does that actually mean? Where are these 90% of emissions coming from, and how do we tackle them? For the fossil fuel companies on this list of biggest emitters, Scope 3, categorized under 11, can be broken down into various activities. These activities are three direct and one indirect. The first is products that directly consume energy during use. For example, cars, aeroplanes, engines, motors, power plants, buildings, appliances, everything we take for granted that we use every day. The second biggest polluter is fuels and feedstocks. So the petrols, the gases, the coals that goes in boilers, that we use to create both heat and energy. And the third biggest producer is the greenhouse gases and products that contain or form greenhouse gases from emissions during use. So through refrigerators, air conditioning equipment, industrial gases, fire extinguishers, and fertilizers. And we also have indirect products that consume energy and fuels during use, which clothing, when you're washing or drying your clothes, you use heat. Food, when you're cooking. Pots and pans require heating, soaps and detergents require heated water. So while it's quite an impactful statement that 100 companies produce 71% of global emissions, when we break it down further, we realize 90% of those emissions are actually directly related to everyday use from us as consumers. So what are we going to be able to do, or how do we tackle this, knowing that it's two parts of the problem? The first part is that these fossil fuels are being produced, and the second part is how do we demand something better or alternative change to ensure that we can have a renewable source? Well, the UK is one of the leaders in phasing out the reliance on fossil fuels through what we've recently seen with decommissioning of coal facilities and placing a greater emphasis on wind power. Coal usage generally around the world grew globally last year. So we're in a situation where we know what the potential biggest polluters are, and we know that we need to tackle them, but they're still on the rise. If we look at the wider market, I think most of us would have seen solar and wind being in the news quite regularly, and it's easy to think there's a big impact from solar and wind that there is. Globally, the energy use market is segmented into 6 main categories. Oil is the biggest use, and it takes up 34% of global consumption. Coal comes in at 27%, with natural gas at 24%. That's when we get to one of our first renewable sources, hydro, which is only 7% of global consumption. Nuclear, with all the risks that come with it, are 4%. And then other renewable at 4% after that. So the renewable energy sources we all know, solar, wind, hydrogen, water, biomass waste, nuclear, take up a very, very small proportion of usage around the world globally as of today, and even after the Paris summit. With the growth in usage of these renewable sources, though, we're seeing governments implement a phased approach to various activities that can actually lead to a big uptake. So if you look in the petrol market, you'll see that certain petrols or fuels in general have to have a certain mix of a biofuel. So for example, corn stover can be turned into bioethanol, which can be added into a mix and put into your car. Often these phased approaches are underpinned by top-down policy in the form of government intervention or subsidies to allow economics to drive change, because one of the biggest barriers to these technologies is not that they don't exist, it's how do we implement them in a cost-effective way and in a way that has the best impact for the economy. So if we're talking about coal, for example, China was one of the biggest state producers and burners of coal. And as much as they have looked towards a greener future, they increased their coal usage last year. And what comes with that is all the jobs and infrastructure in place. So when the UK switched from coal to biomass, billions were spent in order to convert those facilities. And Germany, is one of the leading EU proponents of renewable energy, have skirted the timeframes to an extent of removing coal from the mix. So we're still looking at a case where coal, at 27% of the market share and potentially growing, will still have an impact for the next 10, 20, even 50 years. Looking at just general policy, one of the things I want to refer to is Nina Kelsey, who is an international affairs professor at George Washington University. And she's coined something that we in the Rare Earth team quite like, something called the Green Vortex. We liken it to a black hole being sucked into it, that if you get enough momentum, renewable energy will create its own momentum and change will happen. She's argued that combining financial incentives and technologies can change into a green spiral that can drive decarbonization. She says that there's so much energy spent on trying to convince people what we should do about climate change, and it's gone about as far as it can go. What will fix climate change now is making it profitable for companies to fight climate change. And we are moving towards that with the CDP holding people to account, but we're not moving quickly enough that way. The Green Vortex leverages this idea to describe a positive feedback loop. So how would this work in practice? Policy speeds up the pace of technology development. As technologies develop, they get cheaper. As they get cheaper, more companies adopt them. And as more companies adopt them, their leaders grow more comfortable with climate policy generally, and more supportive of pro-technology policy in particular. As more corporate leaders support climate policy, coalitions change, governments can pass more aggressive measures, and the cycle expands and begins again. The core mechanism here is that subsidies speed up learning by doing. Any industry would eventually figure out how to make a product more cheaply. Subsidies move that learning quicker through time. And as we see in the hemp market, and as we'll get to later, without those subsidies, some of these new technologies are being hampered in the speed of growth to market. An example of what we're talking about took place in the 1970s amid a global surge in the price of oil. Denmark, as one of the leading proponents of renewable energy, began to seed a homegrown wind industry. By the early 80s, this small country, best known for its maritime culture and cheese-filled pastry, found one of its largest markets in the US when California began subsidizing large wind farms. By 1990, 3/4 of the world's installed wind capacity was in that one state. In order to harness the Green Vortex, it isn't as simple as just a few bits of policy. It has to go along the whole value chain. And in order to make decarbonization cheap, the industries that adopt these technologies matter quite a bit. Kelsey, the professor who led this research, has thought carefully about this exact questions. How do we make decarbonization cheap? And what are the industries that will drive this change? And she's come up with that you can divide industries into 4 broad categories. First 2 are fairly straightforward. They're wind industries and looser industries. So solar companies on the whole will prosper. They're in a stage and cycle where we are in agreement that solar is one of the best options we have to create new renewable energy that doesn't rely on fossil fuels. And then there are loser industries, which we hope are the coal mining and traditional oil and gas companies that will be in decline over the coming 20, 30, 40 years. But many, if not most of the companies fall into a category that Kelsey calls resource managers. They respond to climate policy chiefly by using less energy and fewer raw materials, increasing their efficiency and decreasing their electricity use. So this could be something like a Google or Tesco, who are looking for efficiencies of operations. So they're not looking to change potentially the renewable energy they use, but actually looking at doing things in a different way, in an innovative way, to drive costs down and also carbon emissions down too. But precious few industries also fit into a fourth box. And these companies might look like losers under their current business model, but they're basically oil companies restructuring. So if you look at some of the biggest oil companies, Shell, etc., they're driving renewable energy change as well, because they see, like in previous industries, like Nokia losing its market share in mobile phones, that if you don't adapt and innovate, you'll become obsolete. Two of these industries that we think could actually make quite a difference to driving change forward are actually automakers with electrical utilities. They sell products that contribute to climate change, and we have ready-made alternatives in the market. They just need to be supported and driven forward. So we have those alternatives in both electric cars and in biofuels in general. There's been a recent study saying that you can power a car just from ethanol. But the Green Vortex aside, what was apparent from research carried out over the last few years by the International Energy Association is that as a planet, there's a rising global population and additional economic growth, COVID aside, that will drive worldwide energy demand and exceed where we are at the moment in the amount of energy that we need. And one of their conclusions was that if the rate of growth of renewable energy stays the same, and remember, it's only at 4% of other types of renewable energy at the moment around the world, we will never be able to, or not in the near term, be able to meet the change we need to switch fossil fuel to renewables. And also not even be able to meet the new growing demand as well. So the conclusion around this, and getting into more of the area where we as Rare Earth focus on hemp, is that more innovation needs to happen, and we can't be complacent around hearing around wind farms that are happening, around solar that's coming into the market, because there's a very, very long way to go. The change from our point of view will happen in one of three ways as main change drivers. There are others out there, but those are the three things that impact us as a business and also the wider community that we deal with. The first one is battery storage. So while wind and solar are great forms of renewable energy, they have suffered from variability, and the battery technology is not up to being able to even out that variability for reliable sources of power. It's in process at the moment. We're actually working with the battery company, and we believe that it's on the near-term horizon, but it's something that does have to be adapted. Carbon capture systems is another thing that's being proposed as a great solution in the short term, because, as I say, we've known for a long, long time that coal is a polluter. And as I said, this year, we're still seeing an increase in coal usage globally. So knowing that we want to phase out the renewable energy, what can we do in the short term, medium term, to actually capture carbon and stop that from affecting the planet? So carbon capture systems are still in the early stages of development, and it could be a great solution, but something that we have to be very, very aware of is that we don't end up in a similar situation to plastics polluting the ocean. The carbon capture systems we've seen so far end up taking carbon and putting it very, very deep underground. And we don't know how that will affect us in the long term. So innovation needs to happen. It's been happening over the last 10 years, but it's not quite there. And the third and final major thing that can give impact in the short term that's not being supported as yet in the way that we think it should be, is agriculture in general, and from our side, hemp. Agriculture is one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world. It's a near-term solution. And from talking to farms in 36 countries around the world, we're seeing, as of today, plant waste being stored and burnt and emitting when it can actually be used in other products, plastics, concrete, energy as well. So coming back to that and seeing what people are doing in general as organizations and governments to make that happen and where we are, is that it's been recognized that carbon can be, through agriculture, can be a way of reducing the emissions that we've already emitted and going forward making stuff carbon neutral and carbon negative. So as Nimisha's company, Leaving a Legacy, does, where they plant trees, planting trees has been the one recognized thing from the EU and globally that can offset a lot of these carbon emissions from these 100 companies, both Scope 1 and Scope 3. And the EU emissions trading scheme was set up to enable this market to come to fruition. There's also been voluntary carbon markets around the world, but we're in a position where carbon trading is still relatively new. It still needs more understanding, and it underpins a very, very, very small percentage of emissions. So it needs to grow a lot for that to happen. And one of the downsides of carbon trading is that it is increasing potential deforestation, because people are thinking, well, we can just grow more trees and it will offset. But what we're seeing with trees is that trees have life cycles of, on average, 15, 20, 25 years, and they develop complex ecosystems with animals. What we're seeing on the agricultural side is that these are annual crops. 1 acre of hemp, for example, can potentially sequester the same amount of carbon that would take an acre of trees 25 years to do. And so we need to shift the thinking in carbon trading to agriculture. And that's one of the things we're working on. Hopefully we can make some announcement around that. We're exploring it with some of the leading carbon researchers around the world to say, how can we offset it? How can we drive increased agriculture and stop deforestation in general? So, as I say, where we focus as a company is hemp. And where we've been leading to in this talk is hemp is just one piece of many pieces that need to happen in order to reduce carbon. But as a company, what are we doing? What can we do more? What does hemp do? And why is this potentially one of these important pieces that can make the future different? So when we talk about carbon sequestration in agriculture, hemp is probably the best sequester of carbon, if not one of the top few, in order for us to be able to meet the Paris targets. It grows to 3 to 4 meters in 4 months. So it's a very, very quick crop. It doesn't need pesticides. So the pesticide industry does take up a lot of, or does produce a lot of carbon as well. And it remediates land is also something that could be used in crop rotation. So one of the things we found is with the recent Brexit and UK leaving the EU is that a lot of farmers are struggling for alternatives or crops that are viable because most of the farming was actually heavily subsidized. What we see with hemp is that that's an opportunity for farmers to take on another crop and actually fit it within their annual crop rotation. So in the UK, you find most farmers grow wheat. If hemp is done and rolled out in the correct way, you can grow hemp first during the year and then grow wheat second in the year and have a double income. But for those of you who haven't actually come across hemp before, I'll just give a little bit of background before diving into some of the uses that can be done from hemp or made from hemp. Hemp usually, and when people first hear about industrial hemp, they go into Google, they search it, and they hear that there are 25,000 potential uses, followed then by questions around, is this marijuana? It looks the same. And addressing both of those points, on the 25,000 potential uses, hemp was historically an important plant. It was compulsory to grow during Henry VIII's reign. And also it was grown by a lot of the American presidents. And it was used initially for paper, rope, and clothes, so textiles. And even till this day, hemp is used in South Korea and lots of countries around the world, Bulgaria, for those clothes and textiles. And there's a huge amount of water saving and other benefits for long-term usage compared to cotton, though scaling that industry is something that potentially happening at the moment. A few companies in America have partnerships with Levi's to bring that to market. Hemp on the 25,000 usage as well. A lot of people reference Henry Ford. So when he made the first car, supposedly some of the materials on the outside of the car was made out of hemp to make it stronger than steel. Most of that's been a little bit debunked. Hemp can be, and it is used today in BMW and lots of other cars as biocomposites, usually with a mixture of flax. But what we see is that hemp as a crop that is very, very variable generates a lot of excitement, but not a lot of practicality around it. And what we've been trying to do, and a lot of the industry is trying to do, is move away from the 25,000 end users and say, well, what is actually practical today, and what does that mean for us? What's relevant? What can we produce? How is it carbon negative, etc. So the second point around its relation to marijuana, hemp was legal for centuries, industrial hemp. So no THC, which is the psychoactive substance that's illegal around the world, and the reason why marijuana was made illegal. And then hemp was made illegal during the 1930s due to the American government driving a war on drugs. And from the 30s until around 2018, industrial hemp was actually illegal in America. So what we found was that a sister plant to marijuana, the industrial hemp plant that looks exactly the same but has no illegal qualities, was unfairly stopped as an industry going forward. And where we are then is with a plant that has a lot of potential uses, but needs a lot of support for it to come to market and for it to make sense as a solution. So for those who haven't seen a hemp plant, but might have seen a, let's say, marijuana bud, hemp, as I say, grows to around 3 to 4 meters tall. At the top of the plant, it does have some kind of bud and flowers that looks very, very similar to marijuana, but it has nothing illegal in. And then it has seeds at the top. These seeds are very, very small, and they're used in food today. Animal feed, the market's growing, and can be used in biofuels. So in the food market, if you go into any of the Whole Food stores, you'll see hemp protein, and it's recognized as one of the best proteins around the world. As you go down through the plant, you then come to some of the leaves and the flowers, and that's where you get some of the CBD. So again, a lot of people are seeing CBD in food. CBD is also a medicinal product. So the first medicine that was created out of CBD was created in America and verified in America based on epilepsy. But the science behind that, or CBD, was actually first discovered in Israel. So it's a very, very new area of science. Most people still aren't being taught it, but internally in your body, you have an endocannabinoid system. So between industrial hemp and actually marijuana and some other strains as well, you have hundreds of different cannabinoids that actually match up with chemical elements in your body. So CBD is actually a naturally produced product in your body, and it makes you very, very calm. So it's nature's way of creating a similar chemical element that you already have in your body. And then as we go down the plant, we get to the stalk. So the stalk is very, very thin, and it is quite tall. So I think most people might have seen bales of straw or something similar. And the stalk it can be split into about 6 or 7 different parts, but mostly widely commonly used as 2 main parts. So you have a thin layer of fiber on the outside, and imagine, as say, cotton, for example, when you have a reel of it and you pull it off, or fibers in celery. That's very, very similar to the fiber in the stalk, and that's used in textiles, so in clothes. It can be used in insulation. It could also be used in bioplastics, depending on which type of bioplastic you're using. And then on the inside, you have what's basically like a cane, very, very thin bit of wood. It's very, very light colored. And this woody material can be used and is most commonly used in something called hempcrete. So you shred up the wood or the woody material, you add a binder to it, and then you can actually create a concrete. The concrete is not strong enough to be a supporting wall, but can be used in lots of different houses as well. So as a company, and regarding this talk, where we mostly focus on, even though we have expertise around CBD, is on the energy and construction side. As we discussed earlier, in general, these emissions, global emissions, come out through energy use, whether it's direct energy use through combustion of coal or putting it in your car, or usage of products in general, and downstream products, including making plastics. So one of the discussions we've had before is how green are wind turbines? So wind as an energy source is a green energy source, but actually using a fossil fuel plastic in the construction of that, and then energy all along the life cycle of creating that, means that it's not as green as it could be. So looking at hemp that's in use today around the world, it will give us a bit of an understanding of where we are and what needs to be done, because what we've gone to is that potentially hemp's an exciting plant. It has lots of uses, and it has a few uses that we think we can do today. But the question is, apart from legality, why hasn't it been done as yet? What's stopping us from doing it? And then how do we turn this into a product that actually helps alongside solar and other renewable energies to drive change that we need to see? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a snapshot around the world, just where hemp is at the moment, and where the industrial hemp sector is today. In Europe, the cultivation of hemp has been growing strong for a long time. If you look in a certain amount of the Eastern European countries, for example, in Bulgaria, Lithuania, Poland, there has been a very, very strong history of hemp, and it still exists today, where they have traditional ways of making clothes. But through the illegality of marijuana, it has been very, very subdued on its usage and growth. So the acreage that's available today is still a lot less than was available 20, 30 years ago. Having said that, the EU has identified that hemp is one of the crops that could make a difference, and not just to energy, but to many different sectors, as well as having a huge environmental impact on global emissions. So when we go to France and to Holland as well, we have the two biggest growers of industrial hemp in the UK. And up until the late 2000s, 2010 or so, UK was actually the leader in Europe for industrial hemp and products in general. France has benefited from the EU's guidance based on their subsidies for cultivation of the crop. And those subsidies exist across 30 countries in Europe. And the best example that we have to date in Europe of a successful hemp cooperative or business is Le Chanvrier, which established outputs in the construction center using products mostly for animal bedding, insulation, hempcrete, also on the seed side. What we also see in Europe is that one of the biggest uses that no one really seems to know about and it should be more celebrated is in the automotive industry. So there are around 20, 25 car makers, or at least car maker models, that use hemp. And because there wasn't enough hemp, and also because flax has its own attributes, as a hemp flax mix. So flax is another grass crop that grows in a similar way. It's lighter colored, and it also produces an offset. So it's been around 20 to 30 years now that cars, I think it's around 20, 30 years, maybe a little bit less, that cars in Europe and around the world have been using in their car doors, panels, a hemp mixture. And that has been the major driver and the major sustainable use of hemp in the industrial purposes. In America and Canada, Canada has been leading the hemp industry to an extent. And America has been very, very subdued, because until 2018, the industrial hemp market was illegal, even though it has been legal across the world, and it was to do with its marijuana lookalike, basically. We find, though, that Americans, or a few partners that we have in America, have been driving the innovation in the bioplastic space, so providing an alternative to plastics that already exist. And in Canada as well, there's several notable companies that are doing this. And for those who aren't that familiar with plastics, one of the projects that we're in the process of is for football stadium seats. So some of the biggest football clubs have plastic seats in their stadium. And Everton, as an example, have been driving renewable change in general. But if you're looking at plastics, what you end up doing, or what you end up using, is a very, very small pellet. So when you taking a step back, I guess hemp has two major streams of usage around the world in industrial. It's either CBD primarily or for seeds in the protein business. Depending on which ones you optimize for, the hemp seed genetic, the plant, etc., differs. But from both of those uses, you end up with waste material. Some of that waste material is post-extraction. So when I say post-extraction, if you take a plant and you put it in CO2 or you put it in ethanol, you're able to extract the CBD. Some of those materials come in a powder form, and that can be pelleted, or you can actually take a whole of the stalk, shred it up, and then turn that into a pellet as well through high heat forming. Those pellets to date aren't viable as a solution as far as economics. And the reason why is the fossil fuel industry is just a lot cheaper. But where we are at the moment today is that some of those companies in America and worldwide, they have a solution that's a step in the right direction. So if you speak to some of the biggest corporates around their plastic aims, they talk about recycling aims. So they're not actually trying to get rid of plastics from fossil fuels. They're trying to stop using new virgin plastics through recycling. And we have alternatives in the market. It comes from agriculture, so you can actually get corn pellets as well. But where we are on the market is that there's a slight gap between what's available and economies of scale and price point. So what we do have today is a 25% hemp pellet that's 25% hemp and 75% recycled plastic. The difference in price point is negligible between these options if you compare it to a glass fiber pellet. So it's going to be a step change, and it'll take a few years, but we will be able to get to a point where we have 100% hemp pellet that's biocompostable or biodegradable. For those who don't know the difference, they're more or less the same, but it's just basically the pellets are put in a certain environment where there's chemical heat, and they can be broken down. So for those who haven't come across it, they won't break in your hand, or they won't dissolve in your hand as you use it. But looking across the other uses of hemp in America, most of the businesses have been purporting that hemp is a great concrete alternative. So hempcrete is probably the #1 usage you would find when you speak to most Americans if they're looking for usage. And again, that's reiterating it's from the inside core of the hemp stalk. In South America and Canada, we're probably seeing the biggest acreage of hemp in the world outside of China. And in order for those farmers to make it work and viable, they're mostly growing for seed. At the moment, and we'll get to that a little bit later as we go through some of the business models and usage in general. At the moment, if you're not going for CBD or seed as a primary usage, you need a dual purpose crop, which means you use 2 parts of the plant, or triple purpose, or even quadruple purpose, to make the numbers work from farming and processing to match the end products in the fossil fuel market. And to give an indication of where some of the acreage is, or scale-wise, in Canada and some of these countries, well, in Canada and China, some of the leading countries, they're only tens of thousands of acres, where years ago we would have been talking about hundreds of thousands. And for us to be able to meet the demand or even have a dent in the market, we're going to be talking about millions of acres that need to be grown annually. And coming with that acreage that's grown, we get carbon negative solutions. So there have been several studies, including with a European research body called the Nova Institute, which partnered with around 20 different universities around the world in order to study the impact of hemp on carbon sequestration. So basically, if you're producing this product out of hemp, is it a carbon negative solution rather than a carbon positive solution, like using some of the fossil fuel industry? What they found on that is that it is carbon negative. The amount that is carbon negative still needs to be done further studies on. There are about 3 or 4 leading research papers on that, and we're working on producing additional studies on that. But what we find is that hemp as a plant in its roots will never release that carbon that it takes on within the roots. And within the roots, we're looking at around a minimum of 3 tons per acre, but potentially, based on some research, up to about 20 tons per acre of carbon sequestered and held in the roots that are never released. If we're looking at the rest of the plant, and depending on the end uses, if it's in hempcrete, for example, or insulation, we find a double impact of carbon. So the first thing is that while it's growing, it sequesters the carbon and it permanently bonds it within the material stalk. And secondly, in insulation or hempcrete, and we'll come to some examples very shortly, it also, over the lifetime of the product, it ends up absorbing more and more carbon. And it's not only carbon negative, but it's carbon neutral. And actually, as I say, if we start getting up to hundreds of thousands of tons and millions of tons, we're going to start making a significant dent in the carbon emissions globally that are happening today. But as I mentioned before, the UK used to be a leader in industrial hemp. And in many respects, we would see this in the early 2000s. So there have been various documentaries around the impact the UK had on the industrial hemp market. Unfortunately, the market was cut short when the UK decided to pull a lot of the subsidies that existed, because the business models were based on those subsidies that were originally provided from the EU to be able to farm hemp. And those subsidies still exist today in Holland and France, who are the 2 biggest growers and 2 biggest providers of hemp internationally, to an extent, from an industrial side. What we saw, though, in the early 2000s were prime examples that this isn't theoretical or inspirational, but practically has been implemented and actually come up with products that still exist today and that are actually world leaders in what's been done. So in 2000, Adams Brewery built one of the most advanced renewable centers using a hybrid of technologies. So it wasn't just hemp, it was other types of agricultural material, also looking at water, solar. Adams is a small regional brewery. It was founded in 1872, and it's based in Suffolk, but it was something that they decided was important to them. And as I say, this was back in 2000. The size of their warehousing and distribution center that was built out of hemp was about 4,400 meters squared, so pretty big. It's not the smallest warehousing distribution, and if to this date they're running out of it, you want to make sure that you have something that lasts and that works. From the reports and from the building, they measured that 100 to 150 tons of CO2 have been locked in the walls in the building. So hemp grew, it was processed, the walls were used and built out of hemp and lime mixture, lime as a binder. And it was used as an alternative to concrete in a lot of the walls. And after it was then implemented, it also drew an equivalent to 100 to 150 tons of CO2. A conventional brick and block building, so normal concrete, if you want to compare it, of the same size, would have been responsible for a positive emission of 300 to 600 tons of CO2. So this is coming in at negative 150 compared to 600 tons positive, without also factoring in the additional carbon sequestration that the plant did through its growing cycle. The walls were built from lime, quarry waste, and hemp, and they weren't just built because they wanted to use it for the carbon sequestration abilities. They were built because they were deemed excellent materials as far as mechanical, insulating, and environmental qualities. So the standard U value, which relates to insulating environmental qualities, usually is set at 0.35. With additives, they achieved 0.18. So you're moving into a product that might not be able to support load-bearing walls in general, but a product that will sequester carbon and is better for the environment and actually has better mechanical abilities in certain respects. At that stage, the 90,000 lime and hemp blocks that we used in the construction, which was the biggest building of that type using that material at the time, came from Derbyshire. So that's where the lime was, and the hemp was grown locally in East Anglia. So I'd say at that stage, we were leading the world with industrial hemp. And there were various companies, including Hemp Technology, who were pioneering the usage of these products. As I say, unfortunately, subsidies got pulled, their models were based on that, and the whole business model had to change. And it's a change that we need to see, but hasn't been seen as yet in Holland and France, and it's an innovation that needs to happen. We also see that it wasn't just Adnams in the UK who decided that hemp was so great. Marks and Spencer's pulled together one of the world-leading design teams and decided they wanted to build the best renewable energy center for one of their stores globally. And in Cheshire Oak, they built a store in 2012 that addressed several areas of sustainability, including water, energy, waste, biodiversity, community, and materials. And it's still to this date the second biggest M&S store around the world, and the biggest store they've ever built from scratch, with over 148,000 square feet of selling space over 2 floors. To put in context, that's the size of nearly 11 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Cheshire Oaks was the first retail store to use something called HempClad. HempClad, I mean, it's unfortunate that we've seen in the industry, as people have brought some of the products to market, some of the smaller companies have tried to protect their IP, worried that some of the big construction companies will come in and take over the materials. So HempClad is one of several types of insulation that has been trademarked, as well as when we find in the hempcrete industry, something very, very similar in America where there is IP protection around it. But these materials, the processes, should be available for the wider use of the market. But going back to the HempClad, which was innovative at its time and still exists today, but mostly being sold in America, created high levels of insulation to absorb and store CO2 out of paneling. So this is another type of product, a hemp panel. So if most people have seen wooden panels, it's something very, very similar. And we saw this impact on the carbon, the material side, not just from the commercial side, but also in the residential sector in 2012 as well. So hemp was used in a housing development project called the Triangle, where they built 42 homes in partnership with some of the leading designers and environmental companies at the time. It's still to this day located off the Northern Road in Swindon and comprises of 16 2-bed houses, 13 3-bed houses, 7 4-bed houses, 4 1-bed apartments, and 2 2-bed apartments. And the reason why I run through the different uses or different types of houses was that hemp was a success in all of these different end uses. So it didn't matter what type of housing you were trying to do, you could use it. And again, it was very, very similar to Adnams, where they created a concrete alternative and brought it to market, and it worked. This kind of leads us to the next stage of understanding, well, if the UK was the world leader in the 2000s and subsidies were pulled, subsidies still do exist in Holland and France. Why aren't more people using these products? What's stopping us from using it? Has something changed, or what's caused the momentum to dissipate? And just referring again to the housing project, one of the subsidies that were available at that time, which was different to the subsidy for hemp technology. Subsidy for hemp technology was based on subsidies for farmers. This was based on subsidies for actual materials. So the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which has been disbanded and activity has been taken up by BEIS and few other departments, a little bit of DEFRA as well. They were granting at that time £20,000 grants per housing unit where renewables materials were used. So you were seeing a double subsidy, a subsidy both on the farming side, but as well as a subsidy on the materials side. So let's say, as a company, we've been together for around 3 years now and looked into this because we've come across a lot of people who are very, very excited about hemp. We're excited too, but practically there are barriers to making it work that need to be addressed. We believe that we have some of those solutions, but it's something that needs to be borne in mind because as a crop, hemp is a pioneer and it will lead other agricultural crops that can get rid of plastics completely and across lots of different industries, but a change that is more renewable in general. So where we started off a few years ago and where we've ended up is that we appraised the farming infrastructure and the hemp infrastructure in 36 countries around the world. And out of those countries, a lot of them still aren't farming hemp because they're still in the early stages of legislative infrastructure. But what we've come away with is what we hope is a centralized, or what we've done is centralize the knowledge base around the world to develop processes, pricing mechanisms, and infrastructure that needs to take place to take the hemp industry to the next level. As a vertical industry, from policy to end use, so from governments setting how hemp can be used to companies buying it, putting it into products, the industry is still in its infancy. Due to the limited support over the last 70 to 90 years, you found a lot of research grants were held back because of its relation to marijuana. Luckily, in the UK, a lot of that research was taken out in the early 2000s to an extent. Unfortunately, though, that research hasn't been shared or is not readily known about around the world. And one of the things we found, so we've been in touch and working with various universities around the world to bring this to market. One of the things we found is the knowledge base isn't actually shared or available around the world to understand the problems we have with bringing this as a solution to market. So if we look at what needs to be done to turn actually hemp into a scalable solution in the UK and also in developing countries where we said that, look, agriculture is one of the cornerstones of their economy. So if we can create something that's a green oil alternative, hopefully that will have a long-term impact, not only on the world, but also on their economies too. And so I guess where we start is government support, right? So government support happens in two ways. First of all, in the more developed economies, from the subsidy side. There was subsidies for quite a few years and it has been pulled. And when we're building out our model at the moment, we're basing on no subsidies available, but governments do need a little bit of pushing in the right direction to bring some of those subsidies back on the table. The second one is around general government policy in general. So hemp, and as we mentioned, it has no psychoactive elements in, is still under the Controlled Substances Act. So if you want to grow hemp in the UK, you have to apply for a license through the government drug agency rather than through the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. While the amount of that license isn't expensive, relatively speaking, it's actually a lot cheaper than most countries. There's a lot of bureaucracy and it's very, very hard for farmers to get their head around actually applying for these. So there's been a lot of movements in the hemp industry in the UK and worldwide to move it from the drug departments to the environmental departments. And that will actually lead to a big change because one of the next things we find is that government or farmers in general, the knowledge base isn't there around how to farm hemp. So when we speak to some of our farmers in Kentucky or farmers in the UK or farmers in Canada, we're getting back different knowledge bases, a lot of very, very intelligent knowledge, but different knowledge bases. So we need to get that knowledge base centralized and understood. Part of the reason is twofold. So first of all, the seed base, what seeds you can use are actually under scrutiny from different agencies, drug agencies, to make sure that from the CBD side, There is no THC. And so farmers aren't very, very knowledgeable about what seeds can be used. And we end up in the UK importing seeds from France. The second thing is that hemp is great because the fibers are very, very strong. So as I say, if it's processed properly, it can be moved into biocomposites. It's actually stronger than steel. It's lighter than steel too. What that actually has as a downside is a lot of traditional farming equipment can be broken. And a lot of farmers don't know when to grow it and how to grow it. So we've spoken to farmers in the UK recently who've had failed crop cycles. And unfortunately, that wouldn't have happened if they'd just spoken to a few other farmers internationally. So finding something where on both the legislation side, there's a bit of a gap that needs to be closed. And on the farming side, there is a gap that needs to be closed to maximize outputs. I realize I'm probably going into the last 5 minutes of the talk, and I have around probably 10, 15 minutes to go. So I think potentially some of the next questions we can kind of go into, but I'll just kind of skip ahead and address some of the stuff that we're doing today and how they can impact some of the business. So if we're looking at direct solutions to reducing Scope 3 emissions, hemp provides several solutions. So they provide green hydrogen, biomass waste for combustion, biodiesel, and bioethanol. And as a contributory factor to direct solutions, you can also make wind turbine blades out of hemp plastic, and solar panels and battery storage supercapacitors can be made out of hemp graphene. Indirect solutions that also impact the Scope 3 emissions include hempcrete, insulation, wood from hemp, paper, and other similar materials. And when I address these, most of these are ready-day solutions that can be brought to market either with additional infrastructure or research and development carried out. So I think just to finish off, I'll probably just run through some of those materials, and then either we can go into the questions, or I can go on with a few more bits of information. So if we're looking at green hydrogen hasn't really been mentioned as yet in the talk, but it's one of the solutions that a lot of people, governments around the world, researchers think can be one of the next saviors. So as coal is being phased out, it's being phased out in several ways. Natural gas is taking on a lot of that. Green hydrogen alongside solar and wind, with green hydrogen potentially leading on that, could be one of the most renewable sources we can look at. Green hydrogen can be made from hemp in about 3 different ways, and it's still relatively early to market, but a French company over the last year secured investment to develop the first industrial scale, well, at least a reasonable scale size green hydrogen plant. So there needs to be a bit more R&D, and the commercials on it need to be checked, but it's coming, and it's the future of energy that we want to look at. From the biomass waste from hemp on the combustion side, so say replacement for coal and stopping trees from being cut down, what we find is that as we've gone around the world, a lot of farmers don't have end markets for their stalks, right? The stalks that we're talking about that could be turned into energy and construction materials. And the reason why is that they don't have the infrastructure in place to process it, and that's kind of where we sit in as a company. And so what's happening is those stalks are being burnt and releasing carbon dioxide, where it could be actually replace coal or wood pellets and be burnt for a facility that then reduces, let's say, dependence on coal, but also dependence on wood as a source. On the biodiesel side, you can take a seed, you can press it. What comes out of the seed is an oil. So it looks a little bit similar to olive oil. You can actually eat it. So hemp oil is something you get into the market, but as it's refined and put through a centrifuge, you can actually put it directly into a tractor and it will run, or any other diesel engine, and you've got something that runs. The one downside to it is to do with the fact that it freezes under certain temperatures. So you have to add a liquid to it to stop it from freezing. And then we have bioethanol. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, a lot of cars can actually be run on bioethanol. So the way the bioethanol industry works at the moment is America is one of the leading producers of bioethanol. They take corn stover, they take other agricultural crops, they ferment them. A liquid comes off that. They put it on a ship, it comes down to Rotterdam, and then Shell and some of the, just mentioned because I mentioned before, some of the big oil companies end up buying it And where we are at the moment is that those biofuels are put and they're compulsory to be phased into various petrols and diesels. As a solution, hemp isn't quite there. It does need a lot of investment into infrastructure. When we're looking at biorefineries, you start talking about hundreds of millions to make that a solution today. As we mentioned, hemp plastics that go into seats or other products are ready today, but only at a 25% makeup of the final plastic. And that's partly to do with price rather than process. The process is still being approved. But if we're talking about wind turbines, research is being carried out. So if we're talking about biocomposites in general, a biocomposite is a material that's made from a natural source. So instead of a plastic being made from petroleum, let's say I won't go into the process of that right now, but instead of a plastic made from petroleum, what you're doing is you're making it out of an agricultural crop, more or less. And there still needs a bit of research before that's ready to be put into wind turbines. But as I say, hemp is being used or can be used in seats. Hemp is being used in car doors, and the future as something that's actually stronger than steel and many other materials out there, as well as being lighter. As research is carried out and economies of scale come to market, that will be a big thing and a big impact on the environment in general. And then we get to the last bit on the energy side, so hemp graphene. So as I say, when we're talking about the hemp stalk, you've got a woody core bit, you've got a fiber on the outside, and then you want to be able to create something called graphene. So graphene's normally created from carbons, but hemp graphene, through research done by US scientists and verified by a local UK scientist that we're in touch with, if you heat a certain part of the stalk, you can actually then get sheets of graphene, so very, very thin sheets that are transparent. So imagine a very, very thin plastic that you can look through. And those can be used in at least two uses. It can be used in mobile phones eventually as well, but those two uses in energy are solar panels and battery supercapacitors. So all solar panels can be replaced with a hemp alternative. And in batteries, as I mentioned originally, wind and solar are suffering from not being able to store up enough energy and release it when they need to, and release it very, very quickly. So if you're imagining a city, let's say we're in the middle of the Euros at the moment, there's going to be a surge in electricity when everyone switches on the match when England's playing. A supercapacitor allows you to release energy very, very quickly. It's very important to be able to do that. And the product made out of hemp graphene is ready for market, but it needs to go through a few stages to test it at industrial scale. And then, as I say, if we go into hempcrete or insulation or hemp boards, so you can replace all of wood or paper. Out of those, again, those are ready for market, apart from potentially hemp paper, because if you're, as I say, with the fibers, they're very, very strong. If you use normal wood pulp facilities or mills, you're going to have to adjust it because the hemp pulp is a little bit too strong for that. But yeah, just aware of the time. I guess in summary, what we're saying is that 100 companies producing 71% of global emissions isn't the full story. Those companies actually produce a lot less than that. The emissions are coming from scope 1 emissions from various people around the world, scope 3 emissions from those oil companies, but scope 1, which means those organizations are burning coal or using oil to provide energy to actually subsist. So if we were looking to address some of this, hemp is just one of those things in the mix. And if we wanted to drive it forward, the simplest thing as a citizen we could do is actually go and buy hemp seed today as a protein. It'll stop the meat industry from producing as much carbon. There is hemp going into a beef alternative that actually produces hemp. But as a simple driver of the industry, hemp seeds cover the full cost of farming and enable us to use the secondary and tertiary solutions without the government stepping in and creating subsidies. So as a citizen, that's what we want to do. As governments, what we want to do is look for support. We want to look for support and subsidies and legislation to enable it to become easier for farmers to actually grow hemp, support them in doing that. On the farming side, we would look at more of a general knowledge base, and hopefully that's something we would drive. On the infrastructure side, we're hoping we're one of several companies who are going to invest in that infrastructure to be able to bring it. But on the offtake side, what we've confirmed over the last few years is that there are buyers, people are interested, but we're in a situation where we have to address a few points on the price point. So we need to make it relatively equivalent to a fossil fuel product, knowing that they've had years and years of economies of scale built into that. And the second thing is it's a new commodity market. So farmers have no commodity backup. So for example, if we go to Kentucky in America, if you grow corn and you don't have a buyer, you can go to your local elevator. With hemp, there is no commodity market. So it's not just the farmers that need support. It's kind of from an industry perspective, some kind of commodity support and also a standardization of pricing. So if we look at the hemp stalk, we're getting very, very wildly different price points around the world, and that standardization will happen. So if you go to some of the plastic producers in America and Canada, they're saying they're getting their stalks for free. If you come to France and you go to Ukraine, you start paying $500, $600, $1,000 per ton. So these are the kind of challenges that need to be addressed. But hopefully we're one of several companies that are addressing it and will drive the industry forward.
Thank you, Sunny. I think that's really, really, really fascinating. I'll check if there are any other questions. So there's one which says, what's the real impact of mining for renewables for the soil?
Sorry, when you say mining for renewables in the soil, what type of, because mining usually, I say, associate to the mining industry itself. So not quite sure what the question is.
I think they're trying to, well, maybe if we address that, what is the real impact of mining for soil? And then Sagar.
So the mining industry in general for soil.
Yeah.
It's a very, very large impact, but unfortunately I don't have that information to hand. We have been in discussions with 2 or 3 of the largest mining companies around the world to not only sequester their carbon, but remediate their soil. So the mining industry releases a lot of toxins into the soil. And by planting hemp, one of the factors of it, and Sagar, I'll take your question in a second. One of the factors you find is that when you plant hemp, you can actually leach all of these negative qualities in the soil from the soil, and it remediates it to enable us to then plant new crops. Hopefully that answers some of the question.
So his question is also focused on the lithium for electric cars. So I think what he's trying to talk about is, we all say obviously electric vehicles are like good for the environment, renewable energy, but what about the problem with the lithium we mine to service the batteries in those cars?
So yeah, I think it goes back to when I was discussing around looking at the full supply chain of plastics. As Sagar rightly says, we need alternatives to lithium and mining them. So hemp provides some of those materials that go into batteries, and other agricultural crops can provide some of the other materials. But it's something that needs to be addressed, because global emissions are just one part of it. But what we find is in developing countries, which is not quite on the mining point, but a lot of soil has been overfarmed, so it needs to be regenerated. And then we find in some of the developing countries, some of this soil becomes so toxic that it's not possible to live near. It's not possible to do anything else with it. And it's something that does need to be addressed. There hasn't been enough research into remediation on the hemp stalk to understand how much of an impact. We do know it can leach a lot of this stuff from the soil. The question is how much of it and which parts of the plant does it leach it into?
Okay, I've asked Sagar if he's got any more questions, but I think that was pretty comprehensive. So yeah, I think, I learned a lot from this. Honestly, there's so much information to take away, but rightly so, there's so much that needs change. Sagar also mentions renewables are not sustainable and not just a transition at all. Lots of women and girls and slave labor and mining minerals for renewables. So how is that all meeting any of the goals? And I think that's actually quite a valid point. I don't think any industry exists without certain flaws in it. But yeah, I mean, Sunit, do you want to say anything to that?
I think Sagar's completely correct. I mean, when we found out that there's more coal burned last year than the year before, having seen all the governments say this is one of the worst things we can do, your heart kind of drops a little bit. But then you look at it and you say, well, we have what we have, and it has to be an incremental step change. So Sagar's completely correct that all of these issues need to be addressed. There's still a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and it just doesn't fall within global carbon emissions. It's to do with quality of life, moving people out of poverty, making sure people aren't taken advantage of. Hopefully, in a small way, hemp can be one of those solutions because, as I say, if we commoditize the price point, and it does have some of these end uses, and some of the infrastructure can be built in some of the countries around the world. So as a business, we have a connection to a few African countries, including Gambia, which is one of the poorest regions in the world. What you'd hope is that we're just one drop in the ocean of companies like us and other people who've spoken this week and other people who are trying to drive change to make some of this happen and making a better world.
Yep, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think that's a really lovely note to end on. But Sunit, I just wanted to say thank you so much for, giving your time. I, for one, really did take away a lot. And a lot of the talks, I tend to know what is going on. So it's really refreshing to learn something new. So thank you so much for volunteering your time. And like you said, yes, we'll be planting a tree for everyone who's attended. So thank you for all of you who joined the call. And yeah, look forward to connecting with many of you in the near future. And yeah, Sunit, thank you once again.
Thanks, Amisha.